Welcome to the 9th Ordinary Meeting of the Literary and Scientific Society. We'll start, as we do every week, with announcements. The only one that comes off the top of my head is our external convener has some announcements about the Cork IV. Would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this is to do with Cork IV. It's being hosted by the UCC Philosophical Society, and that's on Friday the 25th and Saturday the 27th. You'll get dinner on both days, and you'll get a lunch on the Saturday. So far, we have 3 people who are definitely going, one who's in the Navy, so that's 2 teams. We'll get a bit more interest because this makes up between 5 and 6% of the entire paid membership that I've actually contacted. So we can do better on that front. But yeah, if anyone's interested, and it's one of the best socials of the year, so you may as well attend. We pay the fees. There's no reason why you shouldn't want to go. You pay your own travel. That's what the extent of it.
Ryan, I hear you ask, why would I want to come to such a fun tournament?
Well, we bored you. Drink one bar, okay, whatever you want. It's all on. So if you're interested, talk to me after the debate or whatever you want. Give me your name and then I'll put you down. And that's about the extent of it.
I should emphasize, guys, I wasn't being sarcastic there. It actually genuinely is a really great competition. You spend 2 days in Cork, which, if you've never been to Cork before, it's actually a really great city. It's probably better than Dublin in some ways. Really great nightlife, 2-day competition of really great debating, really interesting motions. And it ends with a Christmas dinner and a karaoke social and a karaoke bar somewhere. So it is really good fun. Moving on from that, if no other member of council has any sort of business to attend to, we'll move on to the minutes from last week's debate. Which motion escapes me? Try it, that's the one, yeah, try it. Thermonuclear oblivion.
Good evening, one and all. The 7th Ordinary Meeting of the Literary took place on the 10th of November and was attended by 35 members. The private members' business was heard from a lot of people. Marty Sullivan began by asking the House to open a window as the room was stuffier than a UUP after-work party. Chris Bratton congratulated both the Irish Rugby squad and Duke, the Great Pyrenees dog, on his election to lead the great town of Cormorant once again as their mayor. In what was by this point a communicative effort to avoid addressing the Donald in the room, Harry Adair spoke about South Korean party politics and Conor O'Neill dropped the F-bomb, Farage. Eventually, Mr. Jack Armstrong plunged his knife into the throbbing testicle of last week's news. He asked if the electoral college, which Donald Trump had previously labelled as a disaster for democracy, should be abolished. John McLean said no, Jamie Cogle said yes, and Conor O'Neill said yes and no. Chris Ryan concluded the debate by saying that the idea of a president as a whole is flawed, and that the US should simply elect Michael D. Higgins. The inevitable question of whether Senator Bernard Bernie Sanders would have won the election then arose. Jason Bunting, salvaging together what little remained of his will to live after Tuesday, stuck to his guns and said that Hillary may not have been the best candidate, but she would have been the best president. Conor O'Neill reckoned that he would have, for Ciara Campbell said something ludicrously libelous, which I can't record in any official capacity. Conor O'Neill asserted that Bernie isn't anti-establishment enough to have won, and meanwhile, Daniel claimed that Hillary was never necessarily popular with anyone, that people just voted for her. Not that many, but something. Chris Pratt concluded the debate over who would have won with 3 immortal words. President Joe Biden. Mercifully, the President's questions were then heard from Jack Armstrong, who asked Mr. Murphy what he had for breakfast that morning. President Murphy claimed that he enjoyed a wholesome cheese on toast, no doubt in an effort to appeal to the working class vote before next year's AGM. Mr. Conor O'Neill then asked the President what he expected to live or be in 10 years' time. The President's response of, "The void," was welcomed by the English punters. Miss Ciara Campbell then asked the President if he considered his diet to be healthy. He responded yes, for a student. And finally, Chris Pratt then asked the President if, in his capacity, he must be sworn to neutrality. Murphy responded by saying that he had no strong feelings one way or the other. Without further ado, President Murphy then announced the motion for the evening: this House would scrap Trident. Opening for the proposition was Mr. Jack Armstrong, who claimed that the UK's Trident missile defence system was nothing more than a relic of the Cold War, unable to tackle any of the real threats that were posed to us in 2016. He asserted that the pursuit of nuclear deterrence only leads to proxy wars like those in Korea, Afghanistan and Vietnam respectively. Mr. Armstrong put forward the claim that Trident is founded purely on wanting the UK to seem like it has the power of bygone days and as a political weapon against the Labour Party. He concluded by saying that Trident is unlikely to make Britain great again. Opening for the opposition was main speaker Ms. Keira Campbell. She stated that ensuring the future of Trident was important for three reasons: jobs, defence and deference. With regards to jobs, she conceded that it is indeed expensive, but the upkeep and maintenance of Trident creates 15,000 high-skilled positions which need to be filled, and that's not even including transportation. Additionally, she claimed that Trident is the reason for the lack of interstate war within Europe, and that it would be difficult to predict the future without it. Finally, she asserted that isolationists like Donald Trump in the White House would no longer be able to depend on the special relationship, and soon we'd be left to fend for ourselves. Renewing Trident, she concluded, is the safe choice. Speaking secondly for the proposition was main speaker, Mr. Peter Murr. He claimed that all the jobs created in ensuring Trident is up to par could still be spent on defence, but in more reasonable and altogether more useful positions, such as in shipbuilding. He mentioned a number of near misses where humanity nearly reached its end because of simple human error or security breaches, before concluding that we wouldn't want to resume control of the nuclear trigger. Continuing with the opposition was Mr. Conor O'Neill. He claimed that to be afraid of a mishap or security breach was ridiculous, as Trident himself has never suffered a scare, most likely going to crash the distant ocean. He rallied against the Brexit argument that all the money being spent on Trident would magically go to the NHS, claiming that it would instead likely go back into the military. He concluded by saying that historically, nuclear weapons are the only weapons which have ensured peace. Concluding for the proposition was Mr. Jason Bunting. He asserted what exactly the opposition defence of safe, asserting that being safe to him would be an adequate funding of the NHS and ensuring an end to the housing crisis. He claimed that mutually insured destruction plays right into Uncle Vladimir's hands, while non-nuclear countries like Germany and Japan are doing just fine. To conclude, he stated that we could install solar panels on every home in Britain for the price of ensuring Trident was ready to fire. Concluding for the opposition and so the debate was main speaker Mr. John McGlynn. He claimed that one country with nuclear weapons attacking another would be mad. He asserted that we can't invent nuclear weapons, so we have cause to make the best use out of them, as they're not going away. He concluded by saying that 3 years ago we'd never have seen Russia wanting to expand its borders, and this is a surefire sign that we cannot predict the future. Questions were heard from Harry Adair, Hugh Dobbin, Keira Campbell, Andrew Neil, Chris Spratt and Harry Adair. A vote based on House opinion was taken which read 11 ayes, 9 nays and 5 abstentions. Meanwhile, a casting vote based on the motion and Speaker's performance and that this House would scrap Trident was taken, which read 6 ayes, 7 nays and 6 abstentions. May I take the message then? Aye.
Thank you for that, Rob, and we now move on to private members' business. Anyone has any sort of committee debates they'd like to talk about, any issues this week they'd like to throw to the floor? Mr. McLean?
There is a big thing in the news about fake stories on Google and Facebook. I wonder if everybody had opinions on the filtering of such media outlets.
I don't have an opinion on the story about fake stories, which may or may not in itself be a fake story. Ms. Pearcott?
Well, there were some teenagers in the US who were basically writing these fake stories and then getting ad revenue from them on Facebook. And I think it was very smart of them to do so. They made a lot of money out of it.
Very capitalistic argument. Would anyone like to respond to that? No? The issue is dead.
No, that's fine. No, okay, just
You can bring it back to
for
that.
all interesting, check your sources before you click the share button, please.
That's fair. Does anyone have any other business before we move on to the main item of private member business? Yourself.
Is Marine Le Pen getting elected? A good thing for France?
Does anyone want to respond to that?
No.
Yeah. No.
I mean, this is kind of why the far right are on the rise, because people's opinion of them is just So I mean,
No, like that reaction was not. That was No. No way. Bloody well, it's not.
That's fair. Would anyone like to respond to that? Anyone like to defend the far right?
I think it will be obviously a disaster for the entire French culture if she is elected, but after the election, Donald Trump's anything's possible. And so, yeah, I think
Just all went downhill from there.
Yeah.
Fair, fair. Anyone want to respond to that? To yourself, Mr. Adam? Or
I'll go you first if you want to. Okay, well, you first. Yeah, in terms of the rise of the populists, which is what we're seeing there, wouldn't we argue that that's a result of a state that doesn't work for the ordinary people?
Interesting. Interesting. Would anyone like to take out that train of thought, Mr. McNally?
What the hell does that even mean?
Would you like to justify your standpoint there, Mr. Neal?
Okay. Well, in terms of the state, I mean the elected body that currently exists in terms of the political elite, and in terms of work for, as in represent the interests of rather than their own interests, in terms of the elite's interests in particular. Does that clarify the point?
Apparently not.
I can't help any further than that.
Mr. Adair, would you like to take up the train of thought?
The conditions that have been laid both in France and in Austria for the upcoming presidential election, which is a rerun of the earlier one, which is a very close call, is starting to become a pattern of in Western politics right now. I was reading the personality profiles and some of the candidates in the opposition and the socialists and Republicans in France, and to be honest, they've got the personality of iron boards. You're going to see a repeat of Hillary Clinton, but probably to a bigger margin in France, considering the dissatisfaction with both major parties, especially Republicans with Sarkozy's involvement, and absolute general withdrawal above Hollande's performance as president. So, although anything can happen in the next few months, assuming things don't change majorly, I don't see how the course of this action can be slowed or reversed in any meaningful capacity.
Fair. Does anyone else have any more comments on the right wing getting the band back together? Mr. Dolben, yourself?
Only that Marine Le Pen is the daughter and political successor of an anti-Semitite Holocaust denier, and while she has never supported those publicly due to the illegality of it, she's never actually condemned it either. And so whether or not she gets elected, it's most definitely not a good thing for France.
Interesting. Interesting.
Well, I'm not quite.
Yourself, sir?
On that
Say your name for the records.
point, Killian Dornan, hello everyone. On that point, we have convicted terrorists running the country for Northern Ireland in Belfast.
I feel like we should somebody brings an issue.
It's a peace process.
So, yeah.
I was never in the hour.
Anybody else want to take a stance on that before we move on to the item business side? Yourself, sir?
And how do you feel about Germany, like having Ronald Reagan, a social democrat, Walter Steinmeier for the new president?
Could you repeat?
Germany having a president elected by both houses of parliament has both major parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Conservatives, have decided on a common candidate. Their current foreign minister, Walter Steinmeier, who will, in all likelihood, unless the sky falls down, will be elected and the next president.
So when the fact that they're in,
and how does
to some extent,
House feel that now Germany will have a president that will be the most establishment and the most typical candidate conceivable? Is that better or worse than a strange, oddball candidate that we have seen in?
So pretty much Hillary on steroids versus the German equivalent of Trump.
Like a mix between Jeb Bush and Hillary.
Jeb Bush. There's a comparison. Does anyone have an opinion on the upcoming battle between German Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton? Oh, Germany. I don't know. I don't know. Does anyone have an opinion on that? Yourself, Mr. Bill.
Well, I'm Jeremy, and sorry?
No.
Walter Steinmeier, he's not an unqualified person for the job, but you mentioned he's an establishment figure. Well, having been foreign minister is being an establishment figure, then I guess so. But in terms of the influence that this might have, I think it will have a great one. The president is pretty much a symbolic figure, represents the state, but doesn't really do much. Signs laws, but has to. So once they're passed, so unless he deems they go against the Constitution. Anyways, so I think it's not a big deal.
So would you rather have German Jeb or German Hillary as president?
I prefer Steinmeier.
Pardon?
I prefer the first one. I mean, Steinmeier.
So German.
Oh,
right.
I guess we mean Hillary.
Fair. Yeah, we'll move on to the final, the substantive piece of business that I want to talk about. We got a ceremonial gavel given to us by the Society last week by the Honourable Member for North Down, Mr. Carter Arnold. Mr. Whitehurst is waving it thusly so you can see said gavel. The gavel needs a name like the S needs a reform of his electoral system. So yeah, we're going to vote on the two names that got those votes and the names were thus. Feel free, if you think either of these two names are non-satisfactory to the name of the gavel, to suggest your own. So with 13 votes topping the polls, for the name of the gavel was Mjolnir, Hammer of the Thunder God, and Bane of the Sea Serpent, Jormungandr? Closely followed by, with 12 votes, was Gavel McGavelface. Closely followed by Harambe, the Hammer of Justice. 8 votes. Coming up behind him was Keith with 5 votes. I love that there was a caucus for Keith. MC Hammer, which was nice, but it's ridiculous. Dignity, which was probably the most dignified name on the poll, ironically. E.L. Gavel with 2 votes. The Gavel with 2 votes. The Mallet of Despair with 1 vote. And then Misspelled Keith with 1 vote. Technically, well, Tiberius is being eliminated because Tiberius didn't get any votes,
Which is particularly odd because someone had to add it on there. Did they not even want to vote for it? Are they that ashamed of Tiberius?
So I think at this point I'm going to take it as the 2 top names are in the running at the minute, unless anyone wants to suggest another name right now to enter into the running. I think we'll just take a simple poll between Mjolnir, Hammer of the Thunder God, and Bane of the Sea Serpent, Jormungandr. That has to be said every time I say. Versus Gavelface, which is not light on brevity, but isn't. I know which one I'd go for anyway. So, I mean, shall we just do show of hands? Does it need to be official? Do I need to have like people's membership cards out about? Does anyone have any questions on the name of the said gavel? You, sir, Mr. Spratt?
Seriously? Really? This is what litterificans from generations to come are going to have to live with. These 2 names. A reference to
the prose edit.
Some joke that has even grown stale now.
So, are you doing like a David Attenborough here and going, oh, we should call it something totally different to Gavel McGavel?
Oh, yes!
Does that affect the
yes!
I said this motion. For the sake of future generations, I say this motion.
I think
local wording.
Even if it's
a moderation, that's what
I propose we name it something historical, so related to the legend, because we had the Dufferin debate and we have the Godkin debate, so we could possibly call it like the Godkin Gavel, because it's alliteration.
We need more reasons to vote for it than just alliteration.
It's historically relevant to the society, and I think that makes sense logically.
On that point, how about we call it McGann's gavel and we had a photo of even McGann's face and we whack it against it? McGann. Or can.
McCann.
Don't wind up with the prick.
I feel like part of a strict apolitical stance, maybe sacrifice if we are
Yeah.
politicians are facing
I mean, that technically brings us to part of political.
I am also gay.
Never say anything joking in here. It's always taking
Adam
serious.
Kidd.
What?
Adam Kidd. What?
Seconded.
That's boring.
That's all
It should be boring.
I'm sorry, the old air is definitely a light cooler.
It shouldn't be cool. Stop being nerds.
Pardon?
Will you those who are worthy lit up and walk from the
President.
Yes.
He makes a strong argument. Okay, all in favour of voting for one of the names that were on the poll versus a new name that we come up with right now, which will probably take longer than the 5 minutes that I will want to listen.
You can abstain and then you don't have to make
Okay, and then you can also abstain as well, and then there will be a further consultative process. All the names set down. The directive will be issued, it will leave, everyone will get tired of it. So yeah, all in favour of voting in principle on one of the names that were chosen out of the vote. Say aye and raise your hand. I count 16. All against using the names that were voted upon, say nay. So that's 4 versus 6. Everyone who abstains on the motion thinks there should technically be another consultative process. They're going to have and say, So I think overwhelmingly it's in favour of using one of the 2 names that were on the Okay, all in favour of Mjolnir, Hammer of the Thunder God, and Zane of the Sea Serpent Lord of Thunder. Please put your hand up and say aye. 13 votes, I count 13 votes in favour of Mjolnir. All in favour of Mjolnir, please say aye. Raise your hands. 8 votes. Any abstentions? 9 votes. Why didn't you put your hand up in the first one? Okay, all in favour of abstaining on those 2. We're to consultative process then, I guess. Say nay and put your hand up. Yes, I know, but I have to account for people who want to abstain on the 2 names in the vote. So you're abstaining on the 2 names. Then thus the gavel is by quite a while called Mjolnir, Hammer of the Thunder God. That's the name of the sea serpent.
I don't even know how to spell that. I'm having to type it on the Twitter here, and I haven't a clue. I don't even know how to Google it.
I can show you how to spell it if you want. Anyway, onward to President's questions. Anyone have any questions for me so we can get on to the annual tonight? Yourself, Mr. Tom.
Would the President enlighten the House as to what he had for breakfast this very morning?
This morning I had a cranberry sausage roll from my local purveyor of baked goods, i.e. Spar. It was actually quite nice and it was also cost effective, so yes. Does anyone else have any questions for me? Mr. Connery.
Mr. President, having heard over the last few weeks what you eat for breakfast, do you live in a castle?
Which apparently is the same thing. Tell you people. No, I can conclusively say I don't. I live in a bungalow. So, yeah. Just to clarify. One more question from you, Sarah.
Is a Byron's bungalow not his castle?
When you can yes. Anyway, moving on to the main item of business this evening. This house would bomb Hiroshima. That's very sudden turn. 1945.
Anyway, Russian.
We're not like it's not for the spectacle bomb Japan today because God knows how many international conventions that reaches. So it's from the perspective of just before the actual bombing of Hiroshima. So with that, I welcome the first speaker for the proposition of the floor, Mr. Stephen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thank you to the President for starting the outline of this speech. Yes, we are talking today about bombing Hiroshima, specifically in 1945. We are talking about that time frame as it stands. We won't be doing any revisionist history, we won't be talking about any what ifs. We will just be outlining methodically a rationale for the bombing of Hiroshima. In 1945, Japan was at war against virtually the whole world. It was unwilling to surrender. Now, it's a historical fact that neither the emperor, nor the junta, nor the civilian government, nor the people were willing to surrender. And the objective of any war is to basically disarm the opponent. You just want to knock the sword out of his hand, make sure that he can't do you any harm, make sure that he cannot resist you. But with Japan, the thing was that Japan's military was completely crippled. They had no fuel, they had no food, they had no arms, and yet the Japanese Empire, with its population of over 100 million, was still fighting, and it was fighting a total war. It was fighting a war in which every man, woman and child was in one form or another engaged in the war effort. Children would be digging holes on the beach and placing mines on likely invasion places. Women were working in factories. Men were manning anti-aircraft guns. Everyone was doing something for the war effort. It was a completely total war. And that's a difficult thing to accept. There were no non-combatants in Japan at that time. Everyone in Japan was very much involved in the war effort. Even the Korean slaves and American, British, Dutch prisoners of war, everyone was involved in the war effort, whether they wanted to not. So the invasion of Japan was going to happen. There was no other way of ending the war. The Japanese people... Go ahead.
There are some very broad statements you're making. Like, are you sure there's not any nuance in the population of Japan and any part of the population that didn't want the war to be?
That's the thing. There was no democracy. The entire population was militarized. And that's the key point. That the entire population of Japan was militarized, involved in the war effort, and ready and willing to fight. Now, let us remember that there was no way of ending the war without actually landing on Japanese soil and taking over Japan on foot effectively. Now, what the Hiroshima bombing did was it ended the war remotely. It ended the war without actually forcing the women, children, and men of Japan to repel an invasion force. Now, the Japanese army wasn't going to surrender. They were going to fight with bamboo spears if necessary, and it would have been a massacre. We all know what happened at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the whole Pacific campaign. It was going to be like that, but it wasn't just going to be Japanese soldiers. There were also going to be women and children doing night charges. Go ahead.
With all due respect, you're talking that there's going to be a massacre, but Hiroshima claimed what 160,000 lives or so. That was more than a massacre.
A massacre of 100 million lives versus 100,000. That's the key thing. And you also preserve the lives of your own men. You preserve the lives of the Japanese. There's 70 million people on the island as at the point of the dropping of the bomb. They are going to be competent, they are going to be fighting, they are going to have to be defeated. The bomb avoided that.
So,
Yes.
I mean, even if opposition accept your point that it's justified to attack the citizens of Japan at the time, how do you justify attacking the future generations of Hiroshima citizens who are subject to much higher rates of cancer and pre-birth defects?
Thank you for raising that point. It's a future point that I would like to, that will be addressed, but there is stigma against those people, but apart, and because, due to the misunderstanding of the nature of nuclear weapons, but there is no issues with birth defects. The Hiroshima bomb was a crude one by any measure. And yet it got the job done. It ended the war. The Nagasaki bomb dropped and prevented. Japan was going to be annihilated. Japan was not a signatory of the Geneva Declaration. And they had a history of abuse and of using chemical and biological weapons against civilians. General Douglas MacArthur, in his preparation for the invasion of mainland Japan, was preparing stockpiles of chemical weapons. Also, America was planning to continue to use any means to overcome. There was going to be a constant bombing, a steady stream of atomic bombs dropped against Japan in the event of a land invasion anyway. But because the House bombed Japan preemptively, the war ended, and there was no need for a campaign. It was going to be the world's first nuclear campaign.
On that point,
go ahead.
Historians still argue today whether or not the bomb actually caused the end of the war, because it wasn't until 6 days after the second bomb that actually surrendered, and it was after the Soviets declared war in Japan that they actually surrendered.
That is a point that will be raised later on, but that's a very fair one. But the Soviet attack was much bloodier than the Russian bombing. Remember that the Russians took over all of northern China, which was filled with over 1 million of Japanese soldiers and millions of Japanese settlers. There is no way of knowing how many. And those settlers were very often killed, murdered, raped. There was complete destruction of the Japanese people done by the Soviet army. Imagine what the invasion of mainland Japan would have been like if there was no bombing. And I would urge you to preserve Japan and vote with the proposition tonight.
The first speaker of the opposition, who's a main speaker in this institution, Sir Josh Sherwood.
I'd just like to apologise, I'm going to have to put up to my Scouse accent for the next 7 minutes, but President Truman's decision to use an atomic bomb against Hiroshima and Nagasaki proves to be one of the most controversial decisions in American history. As the years have passed, the controversy has only intensified more and more. People both in America and abroad have condemned both President Truman and America for that decision, which killed 80,000 people were incinerated instantly. Now in history we have this beautiful thing. It's often relied on too much, but we're all partial to it. Influence how we see and perceive past events, and that's called hindsight. Now sadly, we can't use hindsight in this debate as we're talking from 1945. Our side will be arguing that the bomb should not be dropped, and I would like to briefly outline our arguments. Before I continue, first of all, we believe that the US should take the moral high ground, and the bomb in Hiroshima would have serious consequences, both internationally and within Japan, and that America hasn't looked at the other options that it has. Secondly, we believe that if we did, we'd be carrying out a heinous war crime that would be viewed as illegal under the League of Nations and the view of other countries. And to finish, we believe that the government is only carrying out this attack because it has alternative motives. Now, one of the main reasons that the bomb group will argue is that the bomb needs to be dropped in order to save lives and prevent a prolonged war. But this myth, the US needs to be bombed to save lives, is one of the biggest institutionalized falsehoods in America today. When people try to legitimize bombing Japan, one often hears hypothetical arguments like millions more will die, attributed hidden. It will force Japan to surrender, and if we do this, we have to do this because 3,000 people died at Pearl Harbor. Well, let me tell you, this bomb doesn't need to be dropped, it should not be dropped, and the dropping of this bomb is going to cause misery for untold millions. So the US now stands at a decision. It either bombs Hiroshima and takes the worst decision possible, and it also has alternative decisions. So let me go down that route. One alternative might be to arrange a demonstration of the bomb. Although the US and Japan have no diplomatic relations after Pearl Harbor, if representatives of the Japanese government saw the bomb and the possible effects that it may have on its country, it may be enough to convince them of the foolishness of continued resistance. If not, at least the US can say that it tried allowing this to continue gone.
There would have been a very strong possibility that the information about the bomb being dropped remotely outside of Japan would have been suppressed by the censorship that was in place during the war, and also the fact that America did not have any more than 2 bombs at the moment.
That's true, that is true. What I would like to add is that if Japanese government sees this coming and they know the devastation it's going to have to their country, I'm certain they'll change their minds about continuing in the war. By using the bomb prematurely, as in now, we're risking the fact that the US has not exhausted all of its other democratic options. Now, the second argument for not dropping the bomb is the idea that Russia is close to intervening in the war, leading them to declare war on Japan. Military analysts working for the Joint Intelligence Committee believe that 2 things might happen for the Japanese leadership to surrender. There being an acceptance of the inevitability of defeat, and a clarification from the Americans of the unconditional surrender did not mean national annihilation. The JIC believed, as stated in April 11, 1945, that a Soviet declaration of war on Japan would satisfy the first necessity and Japan would actually surrender. In the report it states, and this is possible that by the end of 1945, the vast majority of Japanese will realise the inevitability of absolute defeat if at any time the USSR should enter the war. All Japanese will realise that absolute defeat is inevitable. Now we know that Russia was going to invade Japan on the 15th of August because it was told when President Roosevelt and Stalin met at Yalta. The Soviet leader had promised that 3 months after the end of the European campaign he would declare war on Japan and move against Japanese forces in China. In July, when President Truman travelled to Germany to meet his Allied leaders for the first time, pinning down Stalin to announce the exact date was done, and Stalin met this and said the 15th. Later that night, Truman wrote in his own diary, most of the big points are settled. He'll be in Japan at the end of the war, and the Finns will be finished. What the argument is saying here is that the government knows that Japan is on its knees. It's like a domino slowly swaying in the breeze, and it only needs one push for it to fall. That push doesn't have to be a nuclear bomb. It can be Russia invading. Go on.
We have the privilege of seeing what happened with the Russian invasion of Germany, of the Baltic states, and of Eastern Europe. How can you say that the same fate to befall Japan is the better alternative?
Well, it's a better alternative because the US has been tapping into Japan's links in over covert missions, and has basically found evidence, without exception, that a President Truman from the acting state and a former American ambassador to Japan basically wrote that he is ready for surrender and that Japan was on its knees, and it was US intelligence that knew this from a conversation between the foreign minister of Japan, and it was stated that that was the case. So America knows that Japan is ready for surrender because it's heard it from its own foreign minister, and all it needs is Russia to invade and that'll be it. So the US is coming from a point that it knows that it doesn't need much, i.e. a nuclear bomb, for Japan to surrender. To summarise then, the US had multiple options of how to bring about Japanese surrender. Option 1 was a show of the bomb to scare the Japanese government. Second was to hold off and wait for the Russians to invade, and lastly was to allow the Japanese government to keep their emperor, knowing that the country was on its knees and would be more likely to. Yeah.
By that I assume you're referring to the, let me check here. Yeah, the Potsdam Agreement, where America asked for unconditional surrender, and of course later on the Japanese government issued a small diplomatic thing for the Russians. They listed what they wanted to surrender. You say they would keep their emperor. But let's look at their other demands, like there shall be no occupation of Japan, they will keep Korea and Taiwan, and there will be no trials for the war crimes that they have committed. I think that perhaps you should also take into consideration all of these other terms which they want.
Yeah, we'll do that later on actually, that's already in someone else's points. But it'll come to you in about 7 minutes and a half. One cannot argue that the US should present itself to the world as a model for human rights. The US should aspire not to just meet the basic code agreed to by the rest of the civilized world, it should aspire to do better. It should be the one that the world turns to when times are rough, and today we stand at the crossroads. Do we head down a path that ends with the destruction of the city and the unjustified killing of thousands? Or do we head down a democratic route that shows the US to be above the rest of the world in setting out a democratic agenda?
This is actually my first debate here, so take it easy on me. Okay. So my main points are we're going to look at some statistics of the actual implications of the invasion of Japan itself. US Chief Army General George Marshall and also the Admiral Ernest King estimate that within the first 30 days of the invasion of Japan, the death toll for the American forces could reach between 30 and 40,000. Within the first 6 months of the war itself, casualties for the Japanese civilians could reach between 5 to 10 million people. Therefore, the bomb would prevent this loss of casualty in the long run. It would be a decisive end to the conflict and prevent a mass loss of life. However, we do take on board the arguments what the defence was saying about the long-term implications of the bomb on generations to come. However, at this time, science did not recognise those future implications, so therefore we have no prior knowledge of that. The American people have spent around $2 billion on taxpayers' money developing this weapon. Therefore, it would be seen as a waste of money if we didn't use it, and it would also hinder the legacy of the former president, Roosevelt, who had recently just died. Also, he kind of stole me a point on the Potsdam Agreement, so we've already declared that Japan had already been warned prior to the invasion if we wanted an unconditional surrender, and therefore we would do anything in our power to achieve that. And
point of information?
Yeah.
So you don't see it as a viable option to try and negotiate that diplomatic?
The Japan military dictatorship is on and unready to participate in surrender. Japanese culture sees surrender as shame, and most people in Japanese society after the invasion committed suicide already. So if the Japanese government had surrendered without the bomb, and it was just seen as we are surrendering without reason, Japanese society and culture would have rejected the government, and therefore a revolution in that country could have started and destabilised that region in the future. Whereas in the long-term benefit, the region had benefits to the American government, but the future threat of the Soviet Union becoming more apparent to the state. And that is my main arguments.
Can I just go back to your point about the bomb being
Yeah.
a waste of money if it wasn't used?
Yeah.
With the whole Manhattan Project, it was to be a deterrent. It was to be to countries, don't mess with the US because we'll drop a nuclear bomb on you. It was never meant to be
Well,
used.
if we look at just warfare and philosophy of justice and eye for an eye, America didn't start this war. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and so were our fellow European allies in that region. Therefore, we were within our rights to use that bomb to end a war that we did not start.
Just war. There's a principle of use in bello is not to use means that are mal se, and don't you believe that the indiscriminate killing of between 120,000 and 280,000 people with 2 atomic bombs and affecting future generations with undue illnesses is not evil in and of itself?
Well, actually, Field Marshal, sorry for my bad interpretation of Japanese language, Hiroshima ordered that in the event of an invasion of the island, 100,000 prisoners of war would be executed immediately. So from our perspective,
They're not abiding by the rules, so why should we? And that's where I am.
So I've got probably 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Does anyone want to answer any questions?
Yeah. In the Eastern campaign, the German military used gas squads to point out villages and communities which they saw as deplorable. I really don't see the moral equivalent of if the enemy does it to us, we should do it to them. I don't think you're honestly addressing the first opposition's argument in that the United States should have taken the high ground and demonstrated the power of a nuclear weapon before they deployed it on what was still considered civilians, even on a total war scenario as you described.
Well, as I said, the Axis powers weren't playing fair games, so they weren't, and this is a total war. There's so much at stake in this conflict. It's not a small regional little conflict between 2 minuscule powers. You're talking about the balance of power for the whole planet. If they are unwilling to, sorry, I'm just finding the words. If they're unwilling to play fair, why should we? Victory is more important in the long term than current ethical debates.
But if US intelligence knows that victory is most important, is that it? Sorry, that's my fault. End the comment, bye.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone?
You mentioned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese fighters in the Pearl Harbor attack were under strict orders not to attack either hospitals or schools, orders which they made good on. Can you honestly compare that to the effect of a nuclear strike?
Is there any evidence that they actually didn't? Are we actually 100% sure?
Yes, there's the fact that no hospitals or schools were bombed during the attack.
That was sort of backed up. Yeah?
Just a question,
yes.
When you're making that point about victory, are you essentially saying that the ends justify the means?
Yeah. From our perspective as the American government, yes.
You're not in protected time, so if you want to sum up, well,
no, that's right.
Another round of applause for another maiden speaker, Mr. Michael Roberts. The opposition for the evening, Ms. Ellie Newton. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Literary, I'm still fairly uncertain as to what tense I'm supposed to be putting this debate. I'm not sure if it is 1945 or it's now or whatever. But throughout my particular speech, as well as doing some rebuttal, I shall be covering why this particular act was or would be an act of war, or act of war crime, why it's unnecessary, and why, as many people said, it was not the design, was not the reason behind the Manhattan Project in the first place. First, some rebuttal. So the first speaker on the opposition said that there's a bit of contradiction between the two speakers, as one saying that there was conditional surrender and one saying that there was absolutely no surrender whatsoever. There was, in fact, the Japanese were wanting to surrender. They were in talks with the Soviet Union to try and create some kind of conversation between the Axis powers and the Allied forces. They were looking for a surrender at the time, whether it be conditional. Ultimately, these bombs were dropped because we were looking for an unconditional surrender as opposed to a conditional one. More than a technicality, I suppose. The surrender was definitely there. Like he said, they weren't in a position to sustain any longer. We were not in a state of emergency at the time, therefore makes it, obviously dropping the bombs was not an emergency procedure, which is what they were there to begin with. And you also mentioned how everyone in Japan was working within factories and was therefore clearly completely in favour of this war. I think taking a job in a factory or working to produce weapons or doing whatever you're going about your daily lives in Japan hardly means that you are 100% supporting your government in the fight that you are in. So I'll begin my points by saying this. The unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. This is the Oxford definition of terrorism. I really ask you how different dropping a bomb on Hiroshima really was. Did it constitute anything less? Most importantly, although obviously we're not supposed to be acting in hindsight here, what would dropping a nuclear bomb mean? What kind of war would it open? From hindsight, we know it began the arms race between two massive superpowers, but at this point we can't know that. But But if we just look to the future, we would be bringing to the table a transition from direct, known, generally accepted forms of weaponry to complete indiscriminate killing of hundreds of thousands without even the attempt and civilian personnel. Whichever one was.
Well, you say that as if the destruction of cities is something new. We bombed Germany, Germany bombed the UK. Let's see, we firebombed basically every industrial centre in Japan at one point or another. We have destroyed cities, they have destroyed cities. We aren't opening up anything, this is how war currently is.
Yes, like you said, we bombed industrial bases, the Germans bombed us, we bombed German military bases, we made distinctions. That was the point, we made distinctions. That's not what a nuclear bomb is, and that's not what they did. The Hague Regulations of Land and Air Warfare of 1907 and of 1922 would deem civilian killing on this size and of this scale as illegal in the accepted war practice. Now, obviously, many crimes of war were committed during the Second World War. However, this would be the USA's first venture into this particular area. So we have mentioned Pearl Harbor. So think about Pearl Harbor. The Americans considered Pearl Harbor to be an act of war. Think about Germany. If Germany had been developing atomic bombs during this period and they had dropped a bomb on Denver or on Boston, when they lost the war, we would have hung them at Nuremberg for crimes of war, because that's what it would have been, and that's how we would have considered it. If, as a nation, the US had lost the war, then they would have been prosecuted as war criminals. Simply because it gives you victory does not make it acceptable. What is immoral when you lose is still immoral when you win. I would argue this was not just a crime of war, it was a crime against humanity. You think of the devastation, think of the hundreds of thousands who were killed, and as someone quite rightly mentioned earlier, the birth defects to come. You were punishing not only a generation of people in Japan, you were punishing a generation to come.
Well, that's quite one.
Yes.
Now, the question of birth defects is quite a vocal one in Japan, and it was after the war. Despite the complete lack of evidence, I would show that there was an increase. There was no increase in birth defects in the immediate aftermath of the war or in the years to come. The people that were in Hiroshima were stigmatized by Japanese society with no evidence to show that there was anything wrong with them genetically or that their children or their grandchildren would be affected.
Well, we're looking at different statistics there because there was evidence of a slight rise in birth defects afterwards, but obviously since we are debating from 1945, we are going on the assumption that radiation could absolutely cause birth defects, and therefore we are making that kind of assumption without any kind of former information regarding that. I would also like to add that this was unnecessary. The state of the war at this point in Japan was that Japan was losing. As you said, Japan was on their knees. Everyone knew this at this time. You said that an invasion of Japan would have been worse. I argue that an invasion of Japan was not even necessary. The air raids that were currently going on and the naval blockades were enough. In fact, they had estimates that said the war would have been over by December, maybe even November, but December at the latest of that particular year. For this, it really does make us think, were they really necessary, and were the position we were in at the time, was it really an emergency? These kinds of bombs were supposed to use in an emergency. Japan was losing, they were in conversation with the Soviet Union. It was not a position where we were on the defensive.
On that point?
Yes.
Well, I think there's reasonable grounds to suggest that the invasion of Japan would have been very similar to the invasion of Germany. From bottom up, a desperate defence would be mounted. Every section of society would be mobilised to defend that they could. Even children, paramilitary organisations to burn the ground and to keep it going. I don't think any of the proposition here suggested that indiscriminate bombing, such as what happened with the strategic bombing campaign that's been going up to that point, was not going to knock them out eventually. However, yes, nuclear bombing certainly did speed that up. And certainly it was a process that also didn't give the Soviets an opportunity to make ground invasion, which would have been absolutely devastating to the Japanese country.
No, that's true, but simply the involvement of the Soviet Union in the war, as some of my colleagues said earlier, would have been enough in order to force Japan to surrender. I'm largely just going to say that we have to think about why the Manhattan Project was started to begin with. The Manhattan Project was there because we thought that Germany was building nuclear weapons. weapons. We thought that they had uranium, what they did, or at this point we don't know that they did, to build nuclear weapons, and therefore it was supposed to be a defence and a deterrence. For this reason, for this and the humanity of the fact that it did cause so much devastation, I urge you to oppose the motion to not bomb Hiroshima.
Thank you. Closing the debate for the proposition this evening, Mr. Matthew Salt.
Ladies and gentlemen and ladies, the opposition in this argument would have you believe that their side is the moral one. They would have you believe that we're some revenge-driven hate monsters who think that we should do this just because we can. Over the next 6.5 minutes or so, I'm going to be explaining just exactly why the opposition does not have the moral argument in this debate, and why, in fact, if we're to take morality into account, the only option available to us is to use these weapons. Now, I'd like to start by... You see, there's been a lot of figures bandied about in this debate of casualty figures, but I'd like to put them into perspective. Now, we expect that using this bomb will result in casualties of 100,000. Those are people who are men, women, children, teachers, doctors, lawyers, soldiers, people of every type. I want you to imagine, if you can, 100,000 deaths. If you can, in your mind. How many people that's? How many graves? Now, that'll be relevant later, because I want you to remember that feeling. It'll be relevant in a couple of minutes. Because we find ourselves faced now with exactly 3 options. The first is to accept Japan's surrender on their terms. Their terms. To keep the empire they've stolen from the lands around them. Their terms. To not be tried for war crimes which they have committed all across Asia. Their terms. To keep their dictator, Hirohito, in power. No, these are not acceptable. I shall not entertain them. I should hope that nobody will entertain them either. But the second option, as my colleagues have said, is to use these weapons to force, immediately, a surrender of the Japanese government by showing that we have the power to destroy them utterly, and that we will use that power if they make it necessary. Now, we expect that if we don't use these weapons, they will not surrender. In fact, the third option. Excuse me, I'm talking about water. The third option available to us will be the bloodiest naval invasion that has ever been seen.
Point of information.
Go ahead, sir.
Your first speaker has already said that the Japanese army has no bullets, has no fuel, has no nothing. You surely accept that that invasion would be as bloody as you say, and it wouldn't be sufficient enough force to show them the surrender the same.
Oh, don't worry.
Weapons would.
I'll get to that in just a second. Because you see, the United States Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, ordered a report from 2 men which would estimate the casualties would be incurred with our side and the Japanese side in the event of a naval invasion of the home islands of Japan. Now, I want to bring you back to the feelings of horror that I hope you felt when I asked you to imagine 100,000 deaths if we were to use this weapon. I want you to multiply that by 8, because that, 8, is how many more times casualties we will have on our side. 800,000 Allied soldiers will be killed in this invasion. That is what we believe.
Point.
Declined at this time. The Japanese fatalities will be far worse. We expect that 5 to 10 million Japanese will die. Now, this isn't just soldiers, because the Japanese have a deeply entrenched culture of non-surrender, a culture which has been instilled through generations of tradition and which has been cemented through their government's propaganda. Now, as an example of this, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, against overwhelming odds, of course we were going to win, 22,000 Japanese soldiers fought against us. Of these, against overwhelming odds, 1,000 surrendered. The rest fought to the death, even when it became clear that they would lose the island. This will be the same in Japan. Men, women and children will take up arms and resist us.
On that point,
Yes, sir.
I really have to disagree with that point. The island hopping campaign, which was conducted, was from soldiers that had been experienced in many other campaigns from well before the invasion began. These were seasoned veterans who stood up and fought against superior odds before. That is miles away from what a conscript on an island who really did not want to be there would install.
Well, you might think that. The reality is, the Japanese government's propaganda has been very effective. They have a fanatically hostile population to us. This won't be like France, where the population wanted us there and wanted us to drive back the Germans. No, in Japan right now, the weak and infirm are laying booby traps down on the beaches where we must invade, and they know this because there are only a few points on the coast which are strategically viable to invade. And the US Secretary of War has stated we shall have to go through an even more bitter Finnish fight than in Germany. We shall incur the losses incident to such a war, not quite now, and we shall leave the Japanese islands even more thoroughly destroyed than was the case in Germany, which, as I'm sure you all know, was devastated. I can't take your point now, and I'm sorry about that.
You made the point before the time, so you can take it if you want.
I don't have time now. So, I understand that this is a hard choice. This is the choice to kill 100,000 people, to destroy a city. However, it is the right choice. It is a choice that we must make. And I would ask you now to make the hard choice. The right choice. The choice that will end this war as quickly as possible. The choice that will force the Japanese government to surrender to us. The choice that will save 10 million lives. The choice to support this motion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Sullivan. And to close the motion for this evening, Mr. Hugh Donovan.
Alright folks, I need to begin this evening by dropping a name which hasn't been specifically named tonight, but is the reason why the US secretaries and generals are exaggerating the claims of casualties, the reasons why they have intentionally refused to try and negotiate with the Japanese, and the reason why they are intentionally trying to make this seem like the most viable option. And that name is Joseph Stalin. He is the reason that they are trying to conclude this entire campaign. It was Mr. Sullivan said, no, we said that they are not revengeful monsters. They're not revengeful monsters, but they are politically fueled monsters. They are not going to drop this bomb because they think it is the quickest way to end the war. They are going to drop this bomb because they want to show Russia who has the biggest guns. And they're going to take tens of thousands of Japanese lives to prove this. And we have multiple ways of proving this. For example, this is being used as a science experiment. Mr. Sullivan said that they've already been carpet bombing so many cities.
On that point?
Yes?
On the point of this just being showing Russia who has the biggest such and such, does that not in itself have value? To be able to cement into the minds of both our own politicians and those in Russia the devastating power of these weapons, that in moments of extremity, and I'm glad that the sides have introduced hindsight into this debate, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the finger was literally hanging over the button, for that memory to be burned into the skulls of every man and woman in this room, does that not have value to stop us and prevent us tipping over that edge?
Well, without the benefit of hindsight, I would say that if this bomb were to be dropped, it might theoretically start an arms race. Without hindsight, it could bring war, it could bring a nuclear war. And in hindsight, maybe a couple of leaders who are named, perhaps without hindsight, Nikita and John, will have only amassed all of these weapons because because of the fear struck in by the prospect of Hiroshima bombing, without hindsight, of course. But the point is that this is why they are doing it. They were intentionally not seeking a more diplomatic or less bloody option. At Potsdam, they had the option of telling Stalin they had this bomb, but they didn't. They didn't do that because they wanted to surprise the Japanese. They wanted to do it to stall the effects of a Russian invasion, to say, you know what, we just want to stage you up here. That's what we want. We're just going through this and trying to combat the Reds, as it were.
On that point,
Yep.
you say that, you know, we're using this bomb to intimidate the Russians. Surely then we wouldn't share our most important strategic asset with people who you seem to think will somehow become our enemies in the future.
See, you admit that we are just doing this to intimidate the Russians and that it's not...
I said that you said that.
I did say that, and I'm saying it because I am correct. The point is, you said that they have been bombing every industrial base in Japan. They have not been bombing Hiroshima. It has been exempt from these bombing campaigns because the American government have cherry-picked it. Because Hiroshima is a flat city.
On that point?
No. They have chosen it because they want to get as much vertical and horizontal distance for their bomb as possible. They want to see what is the maximum number of innocent civilians we can kill. This is the impetus for their reasoning. That is why we cannot support the bombing of Hiroshima, because it is not... Yes?
Why did the US drop it in the air? Why not hit it to the ground? It never actually touched the ground, I don't think. I think it was exploded in the air, the bomb.
Like hindsight, we can't know where this bomb is. It doesn't change the fact that they had the intention of killing as many people as possible with this bomb. My first colleague said that the moral high ground needs to be taken. This is not what's being done. It is only the fact that it's being used as a political weapon. This is not what they are trying to do to end the war. They don't give a damn. They're not thinking. No, they're not thinking about Japanese casualties. To a certain extent, they're not even thinking about American casualties. It's all about the Soviets, and it always has been. This is what ending this conflict is about. Yes.
We talk about fighting Soviets and it's a bad thing. Forget about hindsight. We already know that Stalin is responsible for war crimes against his own people, measuring in millions. Is it really a bad thing that we should show Stalin this tyrant that what we're really made of?
Well, in response to that point, the fact is that this is just turning these Japanese lives into a statistic. We can't make them just a casualty of war for our own political aims. This shouldn't be about us versus Russia. This should be about trying to find the best solution to an already extremely bloody conflict. And the best solution is not to poison the air for future generations to come. You already said, I'm going to address this, you said that we don't know, because we don't have hindsight on and off, that we don't know what it will be, alright? If I built a gun right now, I want to know if this gun works. So that means I need to have you of a target. If I don't know if this gun will shoot you, if I shoot you with it and it kills you, does that make it not my fault? No, because you don't know what something doesn't do, because you don't know what something does do, that doesn't give you a right to use it. And that's the issue with atomic bombs. Go ahead.
I think you quite understand how atomic weapons work. The people at the time had a very good idea of how they work. They already tested it in America on their own soil, and they could see that it doesn't poison the ground, that the half-life of uranium is quite low, that after a week's time, most of the radiation is gone, and it's almost safe to return. At that time, people had more knowledge of how these weapons here than the opposition has right now.
So it doesn't poison the air. The bottom line is that Ellie said already, the reason that we have to do this is that the surrender was there. They have sent ultimatums. There is people within the Japanese government who are very nervous with the continuation of this war. This war was not going to go on. It wasn't. They already showed every indication that they wanted to surrender. And we should have tried to meet those conditions. America are the leaders of the free world. Do they want to do that by saying, we dictate over you with our nuclear arsenal, upset us and we will decimate you? Is that a positive image? It relates to the fact that the first speaker said we must take the moral high ground, and secondly that there were other options available. We were working only on our ulterior motives to try and push ourselves as a superpower. This was not the best resolution to the conflict, and it never could be, as well as the long-term consequences that it has. And furthermore, I would like to end on the fact that they have based their entire argument, all three of these speakers have said on the fact that we'll get them to surrender. We don't have hindsight. And if the Japanese are so committed, how do we know that dropping this bomb will make them surrender either? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We'll now move on to questions from the floor. So we'll do 2 rounds each. So 2 questions to the prop up and any abstaining points on the motion. So we'll start off with a question from the floor. If anyone has a question. Yourself?
Yeah, this is a question for the second speaker. I would like to ask you to explain in more detail than just like one word how you can justify your idea that the ends justify the means.
Well, they've already talked about how they're talking about the Soviet Union and also how there's a plan for the Soviet Union to be in Japan. But can you guarantee me that the Soviet Union will leave Japan and it will become a satellite state in the long term if Japan in the war? Our plan, our strategic plan, is to end the war, colonize Japan for 5 years, and then leave. We don't intend just colonize the railroad, that's what we're working on. Occupy. Same.
I'm so glad we all have such great trust in the American government to simply leave somewhere once it's had a limited period of occupation. They are so great at doing that, at leaving locations stable after they have occupied. That is definitely that is definitely something that it is ludicrous.
He was finishing up his own.
It is ludicrous to try and guarantee that. We know the history of the US government. They can't be trusted with that sort of thing. Should we trust them to occupy for 5 years and instill their futurist style of democracy and then leave after decimating and poisoning hundreds of thousands of people? I don't think so.
You're getting your
All the questions from the opposition, if anyone has anyone from the opposition. Then ask from the proposition or a question.
I don't want to give points, but I do have a question.
David, by all means, is it for the opposition?
Yeah, the opposition.
Yeah, ask the opposition.
I think this is for you. Okay, if they hate the Russians so much, why not just drop a bomb on Russia?
Why not just drop a bomb on Russia? I can think of many, many reasons why we shouldn't drop a bomb on Russia. Going to war with Russia would be a terrible idea. They were technically our allies at the time. They already had control of so many areas in Europe. We were under agreement under Yalta and Potsdam to let them have those areas. In fact, going to war with Russia now would be even more undemocratic and ill-reasoned than bombing Hiroshima. Only slightly up.
Anyone from the proposition want to respond to that?
Well, the idea that we want to defeat Russia at the moment time is a very real one. Remember that we were going to launch an invasion from Italy just to deny Central Europe to Russia because we know that the fate of a Russian occupation of Europe and the implications of that. And then we have, the next few years, we've got a Berlin crisis. So the idea of bombing Russia is very bad, but we need to end the war as quickly. Remember that Russia is also at war. Russian soldiers are being fed, clothed, and transported by the American industry. We need to end the war as quickly as possible and ensure that we don't need to carry the Russia. We don't need to constantly modernize Russian army. We don't need to feed them. We don't need to build an army which is going to oppose us in the possible future without hindsight.
If anyone has sort of abstaining point on the motion, anything they'd like to ask on the debate? No, you're not allowed to ask.
So I promise it's a really abstaining point and it's really relevant and it's really
Does it undermine your status as a proposition speaker?
No, it doesn't even touch on their argument or our argument. It's entirely
I did do it last week.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay, because my dad needs all that.
Alright. So I feel I feel perhaps the motion could have been slightly more precisely worded, given that everybody in this debate has been very confused by the tenses. And originally, it sounded like it was bomb in 2016.
Well, the tapes were briefed to my knowledge that it was the debate was taking place from the position that it was prior to the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. That is how I understand the team was briefed. Yeah. Well, the way the teams were supposed to be briefed is that it was before the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, but that's not what transpired then. Apologies, but I don't think that really undermines the debate as a whole. I think the debate was incredibly constructive either way. So with that, does anyone have a question for the proposition? Yourself, Mr. Better. Mrs.
Okay, Stefan, you said about the fact that Americans had tested the A-bomb before, but they hadn't tested it on people, and obviously the assumption is that they're trying to kill people, but surely they could be thinking about the ramifications and the effects that the radiation would have on people as well, like on a wider reach. So like, I'm just curious as to like, your thoughts on that?
Radiation was greatly misunderstood at the time. We must remember that radiation was a very new invention at the time. But so are computers. Computers were also not known. We cannot deny ourselves progress just because we don't know of what it does. It was, well, whenever the atom bomb was first exploded, the physicists gave it a 50-50 chance of igniting a fusion reaction and exploding the entire atmosphere. We need to...
Sorry, I can't.
We know that we have a very good chance of ending the war if we drop it on Russia.
Let me make this point, please.
We don't know if the war will end, but we know that it's our best shot at ending it. And we know that radiation isn't some kind of boogie monster that's going to poison the atmosphere and poison the earth. We know what the half-life of uranium is. We know what the fallout will be like. We know that Hiroshima right now is a vibrant, developed city. There have been no implications in Hiroshima past the week, and it was known at the time that despite our limited understanding of radiation, we knew what the half-life is, we knew how long that radiation will hang about. What we could not have known is about fetal abnormalities. And there was a spike for children that were in the womb. Now this is kind of I apologize, but there was a spike for the children that were in the womb at the time of the bombing. But afterwards, despite the great stigma that the Japanese people had against survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was no health implications. A man who survived both bombings lived to the age of 92.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The opposition would like to respond to that?
I'd like to respond on 2 rounds. First, you say about how we misunderstood the effects. We misunderstood the knock-on effects of slavery as well. That doesn't make it mean it's okay. And secondly, that you said about how Hiroshima is currently a developing city. That doesn't excuse the fact that so many people were incinerated in atomic fire without hindsight.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we'll have to take one more question for the opposition.
Hi. I was just wondering about your stance on a few issues. Firstly, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, do you think you might have underplayed the uncertainty from your perspective a little bit, or the uncertainty underlying your arguments, mostly regarding the state or the readiness of the Japanese government to surrender soon, and also the ability of the government to enforce this surrender on the population that had been quite radicalized. I mean, if you look at the tactics that were employed throughout the war, kamikaze attacks or suicide attacks, basically, all sorts of other things. If you look at other examples of radicalization in Germany, where you have maybe 12-year-olds fighting in the cities, and you see these similarities, and you see what a radical ideology can do. How can you say that even if the government was ready to surrender, that this would have been carried out across the country effectively. And secondly, I'd just like to say, you pointed out, well, okay, it's not good to kill civilians. And I completely agree, but the thing is, can you really say that you can win a war without destroying infrastructure and the parts of society that are supporting it or propping it up? How can you, winning wars isn't just about destroying soldiers, it's about destroying the munitions factories that they load their guns with. And so I just would like to hear your response on that.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that we wouldn't have, it wouldn't have mattered if the Japanese had surrendered because the people wouldn't have accepted that. Well, if that is the case, then obviously the people may not have accepted a surrender after Hiroshima either. If they were that, radicalized, if they were that under so much propaganda that they weren't going to, go for defeat. And actually, we do know that they were looking for surrender. We do know they were in talks with the Soviet Union. We do know that the emperor said they would agree to a conditional surrender instead of an unconditional one. Surrender was there. It just depended on what kind we were talking about. And so ultimately, if they weren't going to surrender under the current airstrikes and the blockades that were there, there was no guarantee they were going to surrender under Hiroshima either. I mean, maybe the Japanese spirit of let's get up and keep going would have continued even further past that. But we do know that, obviously, with hindsight, that they did obviously surrender after that. But obviously, there was no guarantee Hiroshima would make them surrender any more than anything else would.
The opposition wants to respond.
Well, firstly, I'd like to address, you say about a conditional surrender. I've listed their conditions, such as, why would you think that we shouldn't try war criminals for human experimentation? Because that's what it meant, that's what you really seem to be saying.
Should they try war criminals?
Truman is a war criminal. And in the middle of saying that, I've actually forgotten what I actually said. Question. So I can...
In an incredibly summarised form, repeat the question.
Right. I was just asking about the opposition's view of the uncertainty. Or I was asking whether the opposition was so certain of the things that underpin their argument, and I was also asking them just to reconsider or think about maybe the necessity of sometimes in some circumstances possibly harming civilians.
I think that's a very valid point, because in fact, these aren't entirely innocent people. These are people who are working in factories, building bombs, every single one of which will kill American soldiers. Now, they're not fighting, but they're still killing people.
You sound like an American.
Okay, one more upset point to start with.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's been a lot of claims made about just wars and stuff, and this is an abstaining point. Can both parties, I think accumulatively roughly 150,000 people died from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 60 million people suffered in just the Second World War. Can we all unanimously be agreed that as much as wars are disgraceful and disgusting and inhumane, they are a lot of times necessary, and human casualties are absolutely inevitable?
Proposition, do you want to respond first?
Yes, as we could see in the war, like the beginning of World War II, we could see that the war was absolutely necessary. Even without hindsight, we could see that the Holocaust happened, and that was a result of a lost war, of a lost campaign in Europe. A war waged by any means would be much better than the Holocaust happening. We could see in Japan what the Japanese occupation of China meant. And again, the Japanese home islands were going to be invaded from both sides by Americans from the south and the Russians from the north. And we could see what the Russian occupation of Europe meant. We know what happened to Japanese people in the Kuril Islands, which were occupied. Like most of them, they simply disappeared. They were never heard from again. The population, the indigenous population, the Japanese settlers, any emigres from Asia or the Russian Empire, simply disappeared under the American invasion. we can see that war is dreadful, and the only way of ending war is by winning it, or losing. And losing was not on the table. We had to win it, and we had to drop the bomb to ensure a swift victory. The bomb was going to be used anyway, regardless of the Japanese surrender, and if the Japanese would have not surrendered, they would have been annihilated completely. There would be no Japan today if Japan has not chosen to surrender after the Hiroshima bombings. The Hiroshima bombings were, with hindsight, were the best thing that could possibly happen to Japan.
If the opposition would like to very briefly respond to that before we move to the votes.
I think, as a pacifist, hand on heart, war can never, ever, ever be justifiable. And in the sense of Hiroshima, I do not see how you can argue that bombing a country that's vibrant, that has culture, has millions of citizens, and dropping an atomic bomb on one of their most popular cities is the right way to go about war. The world only functions when countries work together and discuss things. Using hindsight, we know Europe was brought together through peace when countries spoke with each other, creating the European Union. And even though the space about Brexit where we are today, you cannot deny that it has brought peace to our continent. And you go back and you argue that the Middle East, for example, has only been brought about by war, and it can only be fixed through speaking and through debates and through talking and countries coming together. And now going back to Hiroshima, it can only be fixed without war and through countries talking together. And that's the only way it can be fixed.
And with that, we move to the votes. We're going to take two votes tonight, as always. The first vote is going to be on your opinion on the motion prior to the debate secret. So, if you would have voted in favour before entering the room tonight, please raise your hands and say aye. Aye. That is neither here nor there, okay? Make your damn vote. Like, you can't technically vote for yourselves. If you were against the motion before entering the room tonight, please raise your hands and say nay. Nay. And if you didn't really have an opinion on the motion before entering the room tonight, raise your hands and say nah. Nah.
I'll go back to the genital.
I really like Hiroshima more than murder. And the second vote tonight is on the speaker ability. So if you thought the proposition spoke better, the opposition spoke better. Proposition first, if you thought the proposition spoke better, please raise your hand and say aye. This is an official vote, so if you can get your membership cards up, so your So everyone who thought the proposition spoke better tonight, please raise your membership cards very high and say aye.
Aye. You can vote for yourself.
You can vote for yourself if you thought you spoke better.
Hang on a second. I'm not going to vote for that.
If you thought that was hard to count, yeah. So, opposition, if not the opposition spoke better tonight, please raise your hands and say. I don't want to say nay, so. And if you thought both sides spoke equally well or equally rubbish, please raise your hands and say nay. Nay. So So, with 6 ayes and 10 nays on the prior opinion, the motion has failed on speaker ability. The opposition apparently spoke better tonight. So, very well done. Before we adjourn the debates and head to the pub, as I would really like to do, a very great thank you to History Society for hosting this debate alongside us. Speakers in the society, so very well done to them for entering the lion's den, as it were. Thank you very much. And we will adjourn tonight, but before I do that, I will announce the motion for next week's debate, which is open on the spot. Next week's debate is the annual Godkin maiden speakers debate. So if you're in your first year of debating at university, you do not necessarily need to be in your first year of your university degree. By all means, come forward to participate in that. The motion is.
I thought we announced another day.
Yeah.
No, that's the different speaker of the year award, which is next semester. By all means, feel free to participate in that as well. The motion for next week is: this house believes 2016 is the best time to be alive.